There's something graphic and gory when it comes to axe murders. Unfortunately for mankind, history has seen a lot of psychotic axe murderers in its time. You have probably heard of some of these ruthless slayers, like the infamous Lizzie Borden, but other stories you may not have. Hi everybody and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast. Hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always. In episode 4, we're going to talk about axe murders, if you hadn't guessed. There will be some famous murders, some obscure, but unfortunately, all are bloodthirsty and manic. So without further ado, please sit back and relax for more Dark History. At the end of a quiet street in Villisca, Iowa, there sits an old white frame house. Up the street, there are a group of churches, and not far away is a park that faces a school. The old white house looks like many other filling the neighbourhood, but unlike them, it lies abandoned. The house emits no light or sound. The doors are found tightly boarded up. A small sign out the front reads, Villisca Axe Murder House. Despite the ominous air, the little white house was once filled with life. Life that was harshly stamped out one warm summer night in 1912, when a mysterious stranger broke in and viciously bludgeoned its 8 sleeping inhabitants to death. The event would come to be known as the Villisca Axe Murders, and it would baffle law enforcement for over a century. On June the 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds. Joe and Sarah Moore were asleep upstairs, while their 4 children were resting in a room down the hall. In a guest room on the first floor were 2 girls, the Stillinger sisters, who had come for a sleepover. Shortly after midnight, a stranger entered through the unlocked door. Taking an oil lamp from the nearby table and turning it to burn so low it supplied barely enough light to see. On one hand, the stranger held the lamp. In the other, he held an axe. Firstly, the stranger made his way up the stairs, and a seemingly unerring knowledge of the home's layout. He crept past the room with the children and into Mr. and Mrs. Moore's bedroom. Then he made his way to the children's room, and finally back to the bedroom downstairs. In each room, he committed some of the grisliest murders in American history. Then, as quickly and as silently as he had arrived, the stranger left, taking keys from the home and locking the door behind him. The next morning, the neighbours became suspicious, noticing that the usual rambunctious home was dead quiet. They alerted Joe's brother, who arrived to take a look. What he saw after letting himself in with his own key was enough to make him sick. Everybody in the house was dead, all 8 of them bludgeoned beyond recognition. The police determined that the Moore parents were murdered first, and with some obvious force. The axe that had been used to kill them had been swung so high above the murderer's head that it had gouged the ceiling above the bed. Joe alone had been hit with the axe at least 30 times. The faces of both parents, as well as the children, had been reduced to nothing but a bloody pulp. The state of the bodies wasn't the most concerning part, however, once the police had searched the home. After murdering the Moores, the killer had apparently set up some sort of ritual. He had covered the Moores' parents' heads with a sheet, and the Moores' children's faces with clothes. He then went through each room in the house, covering all of the mirrors and the windows with cloths and towels. At some point, he took a 2-pound piece of bacon from the fridge and placed it in the living room, along with a keychain. A bowl of water was found in the home, spirals of blood swirling through it. Police believe the murderer had washed his hands in it before leaving. By the time the police, the coroner, a minister, and several doctors had thoroughly perused the crime scene, word of the vicious crime had spread, and the crowd outside the home had grown. Officials cautioned the townspeople against going inside, but as soon as the premises was clear, at least 100 townspeople gave in to their fascination and traipsed through the bloody spattered home. One of the townspeople even took a fragment of Joe's skull as a keepsake. As for the perpetrator of the murders, the police had shockingly few leads. A few half-hearted efforts to search the town and surrounding countrysides were made, though most officials believed that the suspect would be long gone. Bloodhounds were brought in, but with no success. A few suspects were named over the time though, none of them panned out. The first was Frank Jones, a local businessman who had been in competition with Joe Moore. Moore had worked for Jones for 7 years in the farm equipment sales business before leaving and starting his own rival business. There was also rumours that Joe was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though reports were unfounded. The townspeople insisted, however, that the Moores and the Joneses harboured a deep hatred of each other, though no one admits it was bad enough to spark murder. The second suspect seems far more likely, and even confessed to the murders, though he later recanted claiming police brutality. Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly was an English immigrant who had a history of sexual deviancy and mental problems. He even admitted to being in town the night of the murders and admitted that he had left early in the morning. Though his small stature and meek personality led some to doubt his involvement, there were certain factors police believed that made him the perfect candidate. Kelly was left-handed, which police determined from the blood spatter that the killer must have been. He also had a history with the Moore family, as many had seen him watching them while at church and out about in town. A dry cleaner in the nearby town had received bloody clothes from Kelly a few days after the murders. He also reportedly asked police for access to the home after the crime while posing as a Scotland Yard officer. At one point, after a long interrogation, he eventually signed a confession detailing the crime. However, he almost immediately recanted, and a jury refused to indict him. For years, police looked at every possible scenario that could have culminated in the Villisca Axe murders. Was it a single attack, or part of a larger string of murders? Was it likelier to be a local perpetrator, or was it a travelling killer, simply passing through the town and taking an opportunity? Soon, reports of similar enough crimes happening throughout the country began to pop up. Though the crimes were not quite as gruesome, there were two common threads: the use of an axe as a murder weapon, and the presence of an oil lamp set to burn extremely low at the scene. Despite the commonalities, however, no actual connection could be made. The case eventually ran cold, and the house was boarded up. No sales were ever attempted, and no changes were made to the original layout. Now, the house has become a tourist attraction, and sits at the end of a quiet street as it always has, while life goes on around it, undeterred by the horrors that once were committed within. For over a year, from May 1918 to October 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped with a frenzied panic of a roaming serial killer dubbed the Axeman. Already in the terrifying clutches of the Spanish influenza epidemic, the city would see the first victims succumb to the Axeman. An Italian grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine would die at the sharp end of his blade on May 23, 1918. As they lay sleeping in their apartment above the Maggio grocery store, the killer cut the couple's throats with a straight razor before bashing their heads in with an axe. When law enforcement began to investigate, they found the bloodied clothes of the murderer, as he'd obviously changed into a clean set of clothes before fleeing the scene. Police ruled out robbery as a motive for the attack, as money and valuables left in plain sight were not stolen by the intruder. Near the couple's home, a message written in chalk read, "Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight. Just right, Mrs. Tony." Investigators immediately questioned several people, but all were released for lack of evidence. A little more than a month later, another couple were attacked in the early morning hours of June 27, 1918. Louis Basuma, a grocer, and his missus, Harriet Lowe, lived in the quarters at the back of the store. When no one opened up the store in the morning, they were discovered lying in a pool of blood. Basuma had been struck with an axe above the right temple, and Lowe was hacked over the left ear. Though badly injured, both were still alive. Once again, people were questioned, and one man was arrested, but they were later released. Though the crimes made the newspapers, of bigger note to some was the scandal of the mistress. After the attack, one side of Lowe's face was partially paralysed, and on the 5th of August, she had surgery performed in an effort to correct it. 2 days later, she died, but before she passed, she told authorities she suspected it was Louis Basuma who had attacked her. Basuma was then charged with the murder and served 9 months in prison before being acquitted on May 1, 1919, after a 10-minute jury deliberation. On August 5th, a third similar attack was made on Mrs. Schneider, who was 8 months pregnant. As the 28-year-old lay in bed, she awoke to see a dark figure standing over her and was bashed in the face repeatedly. Shortly after midnight, she was discovered by her husband who was returning from work. Her scalp had been cut open and her face was completely covered in blood, but she survived the attack to give birth to a healthy baby girl 2 days later. One man was arrested on suspicion, but soon released on a lack of evidence. By this time, investigators began to publicly speculate that the attacks were related to the previous incidents involving Basuma and Maggio. Just 5 days later, yet another grocer, a man named Joseph Romano, was attacked on August 10th. The elder grocer lived with his 2 nieces who awoke to the sound of a commotion in the adjoining bedroom where their uncle resided. The girls entered Romano's room to find that he had taken a serious blow to his head and saw the assailant was fleeing. The grocer, thought seriously injured, was able to walk to an ambulance once it arrived, but he died 2 days later due to severe head trauma. The girls were able to provide a brief description of the killer: a dark-skinned, heavily set man who wore a dark suit and a slouched hat. Other clues of the crime were similar to previous ones, such as the scenes were often ransacked but nothing was ever stolen, that the killer used his own hatchet and blades, that the panels of doors or windows were chiselled away to gain entry, and that the majority of the victims were Italian. Yet another series of murders and assaults by the Axeman created a sweeping fear in the city. Police were inundated with reports that the citizens claimed that they'd seen an Axeman lurking the neighbourhoods, axes and chisels found in backyards, and doors and windows that had appeared to have been tampered with. People began to carry loaded shotguns, and family members took turns watching over the families at night. One report alleged that the Axeman was masquerading as a woman, another that he had been seen leaping over back fences. The people were afraid, determined to protect themselves, and bordering on panic, but perhaps the heat generated by the terror was somehow transferred to the Axeman, as the killings and assaults stopped as quickly as they had started. Over the months, the fear waned and the neighbourhoods returned to normal, until March the 10th, 1919, when the Axeman struck again. Charles Cortemelia was an immigrant and a grocer who lived with his wife, Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, in the town of Gretna, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. When screams were heard coming from the Cortemelia residence in the early morning hours, neighbouring grocer, Orlando Giordano, rushed across the street to investigate. There, he found the three had been attacked. Rosie had awakened to find her husband struggling with a large man wielding an axe. When her husband fell to the floor, the assailant turned on her as she held her daughter and begged for their lives. Undaunted, the killer slammed the axe down on both mother and daughter. When the neighbour arrived, Charles lay in a pool of blood on the floor, as Rosie stood in the doorway with a serious head wound. In her arms was the body of their deceased daughter. The couple was rushed to the hospital, where they were both treated for skull fractures. Charles was released 2 days later, while his wife remained in the care of doctors. Upon gaining full consciousness, Rosie stated that the attack was made by the neighbouring grocer, Orlando Giordano, and his 18-year-old son, Frank. Though Orlando, a 69-year-old man, was in too poor health to have committed the crimes, and Frank Giordano was too big to have fit through the panel in the back door, the pair were arrested. Though Charles Cortemelia denied his wife's claims, the Giordanos were charged with the murder and would later be found guilty. Frank was sentenced to hang, and his father to life in prison. After the trial, Charles divorced his wife. About a year later, Rosie Cortemelia reversed her claims, stating that she had falsely accused the two out of jealousy and spite. With her claim being the only evidence against the Giordanos, they were released from jail shortly thereafter. Following the Cortemelia murders, New Orleans was again filled with the terror, and once again began to arm themselves. The police stated that they believed all of the crimes had been committed by the same man, a bloodthirsty man filled with passion of human slaughter. Then a new twist came upon the scene when the Times-Picayune newspaper received a taunting letter on March 14, 1919, that promised another attack. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, ever as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit, and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleans and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except for my bloody axe, besmirched with the blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep my company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offence at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as not to only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc., but tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it is better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need for such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleans think of me as the most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in the close relationship with the angel of death. Now to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on the next Tuesday night, March the 19th, 1919, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If anyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is, some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. Signed, the Axeman. Per the killer's statement that no one listening to jazz on March the 19th would get the axe, the music flowed from homes across much of the city. Dance halls were filled to capacity, and professional and amateur bands played jazz at parties at hundreds of houses around the town, and no one was killed. For several weeks, all was quiet, but people still lived in fear. On August the 10th, 1919, another grocer named Steve Bocker was attacked in his bedroom as he slept. Bocker awoke during the night to find a dark figure looming over his bed. Suffering from a blow from an axe, he survived, and upon regaining consciousness, he ran to the home of his neighbour, Frank Genusa, where he lost consciousness and collapsed. He was then treated for his injuries, but was unable to remember the details of the attack. Like others who had been assailed by the Axeman, nothing was taken from his home, and a panel on the back door of the home had been chiselled away. On September the 2nd, a local druggist named William Carson escaped the lethal Axeman when he fired several shots at the intruder who had broken into his home. The killer left a broken door and an axe behind. On September the 3rd, 1919, a young girl named Sarah Lawman was attacked with an axe while she slept in her locked and shuttered home. When neighbours came to check on the young woman, who had lived alone, they discovered her lying unconscious on her bed, suffering from a severe head injury and missing several teeth. Though she suffered from a brain contusion, she recovered. A bloody axe was discovered in the front lawn of the building. Once again, New Orleans was in a state of hysteria, but nothing more would be heard from the Axeman for nearly 2 months. The last attack came on October the 27th, 1919, when a grocer, Mike Pepitone, was slain. That night, his wife heard a noise and arrived at the door of the bedroom just as a large, axe-wielding man was fleeing the scene. Pepitone had been struck in the head and was covered in his own blood. His murder left his wife and 6 children behind. Mrs. Pepitone, the mother of the 6 children, was unable to describe any characteristics of the killer. The usual clues had been left behind. The authorities continued to work on the case, but it would be in vain. Pepitone's murder was the last known of the Axeman killer. He was never seen or heard from in New Orleans again. Just a couple of the many axe murder stories there. I couldn't imagine being the first responder to one of these scenes. Could you imagine walking into a person's house and finding the bodies hacked and pulverised into a pulpy mess? The metallic taste of blood on your tongue. What drives people to such depravity? With the case in the New Orleans Axeman, it amazes me how much fear he actually managed to instill into the city, and it must have been a sight to behold when a full city blasted jazz music on the say-so of one man. It's quite obvious in this case that he'd harboured a racial hatred for Italians or Italian Americans, because mostly that is who he targeted. This bigoted person managed to bend a full city to his will. But with the Villisca axe murders, it just sounds like a vendetta, to be honest. Unfortunately, I think the father was the main target and the other 7 people were just collateral damage. But you do have to feel for the parents of the 2 girls who were there as a sleepover. Any other night and they would have been safe. Anyway, if you liked the episode, please drop us a review. It helps the podcast out. If you think friends and family may like it, then share it with them. Links to TikTok, YouTube, Insta, the show email and Twitter are below. If you've been listening for a while and not subscribed, please do it. In that way you never miss an episode. So with all that out the way, please join me for episode 5 and more dark history.